little bye. Welcome to Speak with Eve. I'm your host, Eve Eurydice. Today's guest is Matt Taibbi. Matt is an author, journalist, podcaster. He's a fellow Bardian. He is well known for reporting on finance, media, politics. He's a contributing editor to Rolling Stone, and he has a very successful newsletter on Substack. His best-known books, out of half a dozen, are Griftopia, which is how I first read your work, about the financial crisis of 2008, which is still very appropriate, I think. That book, was prophetic. And then you wrote about the campaign trail, Insane Clown President. You wrote the book Hate Inc., about how the media conglomerates are kind of like feeding the division amongst us, because it bulges their profits, I guess, and so they're encouraging our inherent bias as journalists. A very interesting book about the current moment. So I want to ask you today, Matt, about something that's a lot in the zeitgeist, which is the decline and the breakup of the American empire, right? So there was actually a Quinnipiac poll today that came out today that 66% of Americans believe that American democracy is at risk. And I think that probably hasn't happened, since at least these polls began, coming out. And I think that it's because people have lost trust in authority, in institutions, right, in truth tellers. We have scandal mongering and war mongering instead of actual politics. And it seems that even with the Democratic president supported by the progressive wing, we're still in that place of the game of musical chairs between the two mainstream political parties, right, where they're fighting over who takes over the silent majority of the working class and the immigrant class and whatever is left of the middle class. So before I pass the microphone to you, I want to read a couple of your quotes because I think they speak to this beautifully. So this is Matt Taibbi. Conspiracy theorists of the world, believers in the hidden hands of the Rothschilds and the Masons and the Illuminati, we skeptics owe you an apology. You were right. The players may be a little different, but your basic premise is correct. The world is a rigged game. Another quote. In a society governed passively by free markets and free elections, organized greed always defeats disorganized democracy. So clearly, it's like a decade plus from Occupy Wall Street. And I think that the difference between the income gap, let's say, between the 1% and the 99% has only worsened. The debt of the U.S. households is up to 16 trillion, which is greater than the trade deficit. And I think that's how we're all beholden to this system that's like a winner takes all, right, system that's focused on making sure that the vast wealth is in the hands of this tiny minority. And I don't think it matters who the minority is, right? That's the brilliance of America, that unlike the old world, the people can change. It just doesn't matter so long as the minority is sustained. And it's like the theater of politics, the theater of war, again, doesn't matter. It's all distractions. It's like the superstructure, right? Politics and cultural wars and real wars and all of that is just the superstructure, and the substructure, which is, who controls the means of production, let's say, stays the same. So what do you think about, in that context, about the moment we're living in now, and what do you think is the future of America?
Well, that's a very difficult question. I think I will start by saying that I had a very unusual window onto this question because I covered presidential elections beginning in 2004. So I had the experience for 5 consecutive presidential election cycles of going around the country, talking to people and observing the phenomenon that now everybody talks about, which is this sort of snowballing distrust in institutions, which you could see very clearly on both sides of the aisle, beginning, I would say, in the early Obama years, but even maybe before that a little bit. There was a great deal of animosity and distrust among ordinary voters towards institutions that previously had always won implicit trust from voters, including the news media, which had a great fall after the WMD episode. After 2008, there was considerable backlash and outrage toward both the news media, which missed the crash and misdiagnosed it, and then not only that, got it wrong afterwards as well, but also towards the people who were running the economy. There was suddenly a lot of awareness about institutions like the Federal Reserve, which previously Americans didn't really think about all that much, but now suddenly they did. So on the one hand, there was a great deal of this animus that was building in the population towards previously revered institutional structures. And you could see this coming from a mile away long before Donald Trump. I wrote about this in a book 10 years ago in a book called The Great Derangement. And I sort of predicted that there would be a problem in the future where people would stop believing the information that they were told. So that's happening, and I think that was an enormous contributing factor to Donald Trump winning, because Trump is a clever politician, and he picked up early on the fact that institutions like the Fed and NATO and the Pentagon were all very unpopular, and he just said negative things about them and won lots of votes doing so. So that's happening. There's a real and I think deserved mistrust of these institutions on the one hand. On the other hand, there's an additional problem of this phenomenon being hyped to the max. This idea of democracy in crisis has been appropriated more on the Democratic side than the Republican side. But if you look everywhere, you see it, from the Washington Post calling itself Democracy Dies in Darkness, to the constant refrains about attacks on our democracy that you see from politicians. This is heightened anxiety among the upper classes in ways that didn't exist before. So I think it's both a real problem and also an exaggerated problem at the same time. Because if you've lived in another country and you have experience living in places where they have far more serious problems than you do, you would know that America, relatively speaking, is in pretty good shape. But there's a perception here that things are falling apart at the seams. And politically that may be true. It's just, I think, I wonder how real it is compared to how the perception sometimes.
Yeah, well, tonight Biden is going to speak, in Philadelphia about the soul of the nation, which is the democracy at risk. So yeah, of course they capitalize. But it's the same on both sides. It's that mirror effect, because Trump was very much an opportunist, and what helped him is that he didn't have any actual beliefs of his own, so it was easy for him to take in whatever he was picking up around him that other people weren't saying. And I think that Biden is trying to do that as much as possible, right? But the point is, Bernie, yes, he had a heart attack, but basically, Bernie has, in a sense, given up and is gone, sided with the Democrats. And we're watching in real time, Fox and people like Tucker Carlson kind of pull the what's left of the Democratic constituency their way, right? By speaking the populist language very, very clearly, almost like in Marxist terms, but they're not Marxists because, they're capitalists. Of
course. Yeah.
Right. But I wonder if you look like 30 years into the future or 30 years into the future, what are the Republicans going to do with those people? I mean, Trump did nothing, but other than like printing Trump dollars, he got saved by the pandemic, basically, right? So, but it's not like the 1% is going to let anybody do anything. So at some point, all of these, growing numbers of disadvantaged people, who now are looking for salvation, either extreme places in the parties, right? Or in crypto, or all kinds of other like hacks, meta. But at some point, there has to be a moment when they all figure out that things are getting worse. And there is no way out. And we are awash in guns. And so we do have something that these other countries where things are tough don't have, which is, this tradition of like taking to the streets and the means to do so. So, I mean, is it possible that this will just go on indefinitely? And nothing will happen. The people will not take it to the streets. And I guess like a related question, I'm sorry to interrupt, a related question in my mind is like, what happened to Occupy Wall Street? What happened to Black Lives Matter? Like, why do these movements, peter out so quickly?
Well, with regard to the first question, I would say no, of course this can't go on indefinitely. The frustrations are too serious. Moreover, the political divisions up on high are too pronounced now. If the Democrats were to do something like try to indict Donald Trump and prevent him from running for the presidency, it's hard for me to imagine a scenario where there wouldn't be some kind of very serious upheaval that resulted from that. As you mentioned, this is a heavily armed country. We're, more so than almost any other place in the world. I have a friend who used to be a correspondent in the former Yugoslavia, and he speaks often of the phenomenon of a heavily armed population that is watching media that is designed to make people angry with other groups. And we know how that turned out there, and that could easily happen in the United States. We have more guns in this country, and some kind of balkanization scenario I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility at all. Which would be, very sad. We've been through a lot in this country and avoided that so far, but it does feel like we're headed towards some kind of impasse, and I don't know how we'll come out on the other side of it. I hope that won't be true. I mean, I do believe that ultimately we're a resourceful country, and we tend to avoid disaster at the last minute. But who knows? As for those movements, I think those are two completely different stories. Occupy Wall Street, which I was part of, I think I do think it accomplished something that was very important. Even though it fell far short of whatever its goals were from minute to minute, it accomplished one thing that was concrete and will last with us for a long time, which was defining the population not in terms of left or right and blue or red, but in terms of the 1% and the 99%, which I think is a much more accurate way of looking at American politics than anything that had come along previously. And that way of thinking is in everybody's lexicon now, and everybody understands it. More to the point, I think it's become more and more pertinent as time has passed. The post-2008 economy, as you mentioned, the income gap has widened as we've become progressively more and more dependent upon central bank spending. We've seen this effect where this enormous amount of public largesse gets dumped into the economy, and the people who are most skilled at investing, on the riskier end of the yield curve tend to end up with most of the money. And the philosophy of it trickling down to the bottom hasn't really come to pass. So the more we spend, and we spent a ton during the pandemic relief period. Remember, the Fed added $4.6 trillion to its balance sheet. And where did that money go? Well, most of it went to the very, very wealthy in this country, wrapping their heads around the complex financial concepts involved. Black Lives Matter is police brutality. I wrote 2 books about that. I do think they've accomplished some things. There have been a number of measures. Stop and frisk has essentially been stopped in a lot of cities. The number of contacts between police and the population is decreased in some places. There have been new laws about body cams, about eliminating this sort of bizarre privacy exemptions that police once had. But the rest of the movement receiving an enormous amount of corporate money, which in my mind perverted their mission a little bit and directed them more towards the workplace, towards diversity and equity training, as opposed to campaigning for hardcore reforms of police and other matters like that. It's become a social phenomenon for profit, and I worry about that. I don't think that's been a positive, or wholly a positive anyway.
Again, I think it's fitting the division that we were talking about, and I think it's something that has been taken advantage of. As pretty much everything else that we've organized for can be taken advantage of by this, really kind of like anonymous, right? 1% or 0.1% or, whatever that is. And again, personalizing those people, I think, is our mistake. The system doesn't care if the 1% or the 0.1% is all people of color or all people of, trans identity, or it doesn't matter. The system doesn't care about the personal identity stuff at all. What matters is the setup, the structure, the extreme, narrow hierarchy, right? With the assumption that when you get to that amount of wealth, you become that kind of person. It doesn't matter who it is. The greed, let's say, or wealth corrupts. I mean, and that's very simplistic, but
and that's been a big source of frustration for me personally, having spent a lot of time on both of those issues in the last 10 years or so. I think people are very easily fooled by appearances. If they see that a corporate boardroom suddenly looks more diverse, they believe that the problem has been solved somehow, that somehow we're fixing racial inequity issues. Actually, really what they've done is they've cosmetically changed a few things within a company, and most of the persistent problems about poverty, the income gap, loss of opportunity, loss of infrastructure spending, all of those things, are either staying in place or getting worse. So, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's been a frustration.
Yeah, you're right. It's that's why that quote, when you talk about the system being rigged, period, I think is so powerful. It's now we see it with, green energy and climate change. And it's who's going to profit from all the electrical batteries or the solar energy infrastructure or whatever. It's the exact same setup. It doesn't matter whether we're dealing with fossil fuel or with another source of energy in the end, right? So.
Right. Yeah. And Yeah, and just I'm sorry to interrupt again, but just quickly, I think this was one of the big takeaways from 2008 for most people. I mean, most people that I interview on the campaign trail, before 2008, they didn't really spend a lot of time thinking about the macro economy or about any of those institutions. But for a variety of reasons, they were forced to after 2008. And one of the main takeaways they got was that the government spent an enormous amount of money, far more than $800 million or $800 billion. It was in the trillions if you include Fed lending. And really what they did is they spent a lot of money to make whole the same bad actors who caused the financial crisis. And then those people walked away with their bonuses intact and, their beach houses intact, and they got to keep everything, and in many cases profited and made more on stock buybacks the next year. Whereas the ordinary person got foreclosed upon and saw their retirement fund lose 30 or 40% of its value. And so even people who don't read the news and vote for Trump, when I talk to those people, they come away with this thing like, those people only help themselves. They don't help me. So I'm going to help myself, or I'm going to send them a message. And I think they think that about almost any government program now, or any elite program.
Right. And by they, I would like to say we.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, and, I think that you're right. I haven't thought of it as precisely, but I do agree that something monumental happened in 2008 of the size of the September 11, in the sense of consciousness changing. It was equally consciousness changing because, we as America, as an economy, spent so much to keep the system in place. No matter what, right? And then from then on, we learned about printing money. Every time there was an election, the Fed kept printing money, and that's how elections were won. The Democrats completely sold out. If there was anything left over from the Democratic promises that had been, broken by Clinton, it was finished then and there, right? I actually voted for Romney. I just felt so extremely betrayed because we had attached so much hope to the, Obama, to the symbolic Obama victory. And this happened right, his reaction happened right after. And it didn't really differ from what one would have expected from, his opponents. So it became clear that this
it was worse than that. It
right.
was exactly the same policy.
Right.
they literally continued exactly the bailout policy.
Right.
So.
And that's when I thought consciously, I was like, I'm no longer falling for this lesser of two evils. I'm not doing it anymore. I don't care how horrific the other side is, and I'm just not doing it anymore because it's emotional blackmail, and I have to learn my lesson, right, at some point. And yes, I think soon after 2010, we have Citizens United, right? Corporations are people, so it has kind of entrenched this plutocracy as the American system of governance, and that's about it. I think that there is no doubt about it. So what's been happening since may be explained as more and more people in different ways learning this huge lesson, right? And if there is in fact now going to be a tightening of the economy, and then we see from the way crypto is reacting that was false promise too. So, that was another Griftopia, to quote you, right? Just like pretty much everything that has to do with Trump is turning out to be Griftopia, including these documents under his passports in the drawer. I mean.
Right.
So, yeah, we're all slowly kind of learning this extremely painful lesson that we have nowhere to turn to. And that's where my question comes in, where do we go when enough of us, and ironically, what keeps saving America, I think, is the immigration. I mean, I know it as an immigrant who came here for freedom, I know very much how real that is. This sense that you have coming from the old world, where you feel watched, and where there's so many boundaries of behavior and speech, right, and identity, to just come here and experience the freedom in the superstructure. So is amazing, right? And it's very enticing. But at some point, when all of this ends, or when more and more people understand what's happening, and America, meanwhile, is globalized. Everybody's an American in a sense now, right? So if there is a Balkanization of America, there is a Balkanization of the world, no?
Right. Yeah. That's absolutely true. Also, I think polls will back up what you're saying, that the people who are most patriotic in America tend to be the very recent immigrants. The groups that are doing the best in America tend to be very recent immigrants. So, West Africans, South Asians, they're really flourishing in the United States, or they were until very recently. And they're our best advocates around the world. The problem really is with people who grew up here, who grew up and have memories of another time when things were different. And those voters tend to be profoundly pessimistic. There was a book by, a really interesting book by a former CIA analyst called The Revolt of the Public by a writer named Martin Gurry. And his thesis was that in the internet age, ordinary people had so much access to information about their leaders and about the institutions that controlled them that they lost their ability to be mesmerized and to believe in the infallibility of their leaders and the leadership structures. And they began to see all the warts that had been there all along, but now they're much more visible. And I think that's very, very true now. People are able to see through the system a lot more easily than they used to. And then when you add a compounding factor like something on the scale of the Iraq invasion collapsing and turning into the disaster that it did after commensurate failure by the media to report the matter correctly. I thought that was devastating to the Pentagon, to the news media, to the White House. Then you add, again, the 2008 financial crisis, which showed that the financial regulatory system didn't work. We had a myth about self-regulation within the financial services community. We have been assured over and over and over again that these big banks were on top of every conceivable market movement and that they would never allow us to go down a path of, let's just say, a giant Ponzi scheme like the housing market. And they all completely failed in that endeavor. And many of them turned out to be the biggest losers in the whole affair. You add the politicians who didn't know what to do, who it turned out didn't even know what a mortgage-backed security was. I covered those people. There were maybe 2 members of the Senate during the 2008 crisis who could speak intelligibly about the causes of the crash, which was a huge shock to Americans, right? So they're turning on their televisions and they're seeing that their leaders literally don't know what they're talking about in the middle of a crisis. So all of these things were really demystifying. And so when somebody like Donald Trump comes along and says, look, these guys are idiots. They don't know what they're doing. They're taking your money. They've never had to work hard for $1 in their entire lives. They've never done a high level deal. They don't know they don't know anything. You might as well put me in charge. I've at least run a company. Right. Yeah. And this was a very appealing argument to people. I mean, I think a lot of educated Americans don't really see that, but if you work in a small town in Nebraska and your only experience with authority is the guy who runs the local Walmart, you're going to look up to the business leader. You just will. And
Right.
I think you take that pitch mixed with all this evidence of incompetence, and it was really, really appealing to people.
Yeah. And the Democrats didn't learn from it, clearly, because it was not about wanting Trump. It was about not wanting Hillary. And here we are with Biden. So, but, I still think that we are like an economic crash and a nuclear error away from a mass movement, right? I mean, it will just take one crisis like the one in 2008, but, stronger. And it's possible that, the people will wake up out of the stupor, basically, and act and take to the streets and stay on the streets, which would be great. The thing is to stay on the streets.
It
Not
could
go
be
back
great.
home.
It could be awful too. So yeah,
personally, it would be terrible, right, for each one of us. But in the big picture of history,
if you want change, it's a good thing. But it could be very, very messy when that happens.
Yeah.
But yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and so perhaps the powers that be will heed the warning, and come up with programs of social, like of real social reprogramming updates, that will change the system. That would be amazing. So yeah.
Well, but the thing about that is I wouldn't hold my breath for that because after 2008. Which I covered, I had to go out and talk to people all over the campaign trail. And it was manifestly obvious that there was a real crisis of confidence just in government in general, all over the country. People did not believe their leaders. They voted for Trump because he was, quote unquote, not a politician, right? And anybody who was paying even a modicum of attention should have understood. And Bernie Sanders understood this. I talked to him about this after the election. They should have understood that priority number one is we have to do better, right? Like we have to stop promising people that their jobs are going to come back after NAFTA. We have to actually come up with some kind of plan that changes the fundamental situation for ordinary people. And instead of doing that, they continually put all their chips into these political gambits, like Russiagate, like Ukrainegate, like Bountygate. Now like January 6th was done a little bit more out of necessity, I think, but still. And Biden tonight is, the big reveal in his speech is going to be he's going to identify the Republican Party as an extreme threat. He's going to say things about MAGA Republicans being prone to violence, and there's a danger there because in the war on terror era, if you call somebody a terrorist, that has some pretty concrete meaning. They can be put on watch lists. They can, their bank records can be looked at. You can put them under surveillance. You can deny them travel rights. There's all kinds of things you can do once you classify somebody that way. And so that is another political gambit. Apart from the forgiveness of the student loans, they still haven't moved in the direction of, oh my God, we have to do something to help people, which is their only way out of the situation. Both the Democrats and the Republicans, that they have to do something, and they don't seem to get it, and they're doing something else instead.
No, they're not going to do it. I mean, Clinton ended the welfare system, and that's it. We have like these very clear blinders of like greed is good since, the era you were talking about, and Wall Street is the economy. And so we've gone way far into this kind of like idea of, money brings money and money is all there is, right? So I think that for me, the only way to move forward is to also change, fundamentally our consciousness of what it is to be human, and to kind of like demonetize humanity, like separate love from money, separate family from money, separate trust from money, right? There is a lot of all of this work that I think, will have to be done for us to evolve. Have you thought at all about this Armageddon, the QAnon, and before that, the Tea Party people, right? They have always been waiting. They've always been waiting for it. And it's back again, this talk of like the second coming with the FBI raid. The talk of Trump's second coming is back. And when he said today, he truthed today. It really reminds me of Stephen Colbert's truthing. But he truthed today that, the only solution is for him to be reinstated as president, basically. So, this idea of like, the savior coming on the stallion and confronting the devil and his minions, and then the savior opens his mouth and all the minions disappear, and just the savior and Satan, and then Christ, Christ or whoever Christ may be, opens his mouth and a gigantic sword comes out and destroys the Satan, and then you have 1,000 years of peace and prosperity on earth. And then after that is when the trial comes and everybody gets to choose, and the assumption is that, having experienced 1,000 years of peace and prosperity, everybody's going to be like, I'm like for the side that gave us that, right? So this narrative, it's interesting because America was built by people, like me, who are believers in like a new world, right? A new way of doing things, right? That was not like the old world. So many have been, evangelicals, like whether it's the Puritans or now the evangelicals, it's the same idea of like really having a very potent and powerful faith and optimism in the goodness, right? And paying the price to make this a better, a fair society. And that's the promise of the American experiment. Like that's the Bill of Rights. That was that revolution. And there is one way of seeing it, which is not, like maybe the elite way of seeing it, which is that America has fought again and again against its worst instincts. It's fought against like what it inherited, right? Because it inherited slavery. I mean, it was made by colonizing occupiers, and it inherited the horrors of like, what happened to the indigenous people. It inherited the slave owning that came from its founders even before the revolution. And it has also inherited this tendency for empire, which became very strong with World War II, which is like, the temptation to like rule the world, which like I understand. I mean, if you can be like on top of the jungle, pounding your chest and saying, I'm like the biggest power, I'm the biggest guy here, right? That's such a high. It's very hard to resist that temptation. But all of that's like old world kind of like patriarchy, sins and oppressions that were inevitably, bringing in, because we've inherited that, but it's not who we are. So how do we find?
I don't know. I think it is who we are. I would argue that the messianic component of the American character has always been with us. It was an essential part of the Puritan philosophy. I mean, I grew up not far from Plymouth, Massachusetts, the heart of Puritan America, right? And the Puritans brought with them this idea that they were building a shining city on the hill, that they were going to be the leaders of a great movement that was going to spread enlightenment all over the world. And this has consistently been a part of the way America views its relationship to everybody else. From the Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny, through the League of Nations and Woodrow Wilson, to World War II, when we essentially took over the role that the Britons had as the world's dominant seafaring power and controlling the trade routes, to the current incarnation. Well, I skipped over Bush, who overtly talked about conquering the axis of evil and spreading democracy, and that we formally have a program that we call democracy promotion everywhere. And we're now in this place, which I think is very dangerous, because we're not taking on little countries like Iraq or Iran or even North Korea anymore. Now, this idea of confronting autocracy, which is part of the new language, and spreading democracy everywhere. This is bringing us on a crash course with China and Russia, who are two incredibly powerful countries, China more so than Russia, but still, this is no joke. I mean, we sent $1 billion in arms, or about to send $1 billion more in arms to Taiwan at a moment where we've already embarked upon basically an open-ended, very expensive, very risky proxy campaign in Ukraine
against Russia. Against
Russia. So the possibility exists that, a year from now, we're going to be in a two-front world war, essentially.
I think so too.
With powers that, the Russians are not as powerful as we are, but they have the nuclear arsenal, of course, that we have to worry about. But China, I think Americans really have lost their ability to think rationally about how diplomacy works, and how sometimes you have to make concessions to keep the peace. And, the same kinds of thinking that allowed us to maintain kind of a tenuous stasis for half a century after World War II. We've lost that ability to think in those terms. We have this messianic character to how we think about problems like Russia and Ukraine and China and Taiwan, and that stuff terrifies me, just because there's an illusion that there's somebody up there who's smarter than we all are thinking about this, but I don't think that's true. I think it's just more people, more of the same kinds of mediocrities we went to college with, who are in positions of power, and I don't think they're up for the task, personally.
Well, but it makes for great TV and great ratings, and also it makes for the best distraction tactics, right? It throws sand in our eyes. So if we have a recession, and if people are getting miserable and there is unrest, what best but to get into some sort of like world war, which now they think is going to be fought with like drones, and so it's always going to be popular because we're not going to have warm bodies and on the ground in faraway countries, and we're only going to be watching it like vicariously. But really, it's a win-win for the politicians because it's not real war. But war in Europe with nuclear, with so many kind of like nuclear warheads involved is very real. And I think war with China would become very real. And I agree with you. It's very likely next year to have a couple of serious wars that feel not real because they're still outside our borders and we've never been invaded and we don't have that trauma. Like the rest of us, I mean, I'm Greek, and the trauma of having been occupied, has been passed down to me repeatedly by my parents that were alive in World War II, so there is a lot of like memory of what it means.
And reflexive resistance to the idea.
Yes. Yes. And therefore, a lot of like an inherent pacifism. A desire to kind of like, make peace, because, the alternative is so horrid. It's suicidal, and yeah, there is kind of like, it's almost like, in the sense like Trump has had a suicidal impulse, I think, when he ran. Like we all said, I mean, he has so much to lose. There's so many dirty deals. Is he crazy to be running for president, right? And even now, there is this suicidal element of like, why is he bringing attention to the raid when, I mean, so it's a similar thing with like America or, the Pentagon. There is kind of that sense of like, tendency to self-harm. That's almost like the addict. You're addicted to this like high of power, and the addiction is self-harming. But if there is a couple of world wars, it's almost like global civil war. Like my country, for example, has transformed so much since 2010, since the Greek death, really. All of Europe has transformed since we all became Germans.
Right.
We all used, what used to be the mark, basically, the Deutsche Mark. So I think that by bullying the world into becoming democratic, democracy is losing its sparkle, because you can force it, can't force it into people. Like no one wants what they have no choice but to take, right? So it's just not going to be popular.
Also, there's a whole range of unintended or unforeseen consequences that the average American doesn't think about, but will suddenly become factors in their lives very quickly as this whole situation develops. Just this week, we are seeing, we saw prices for American natural gas hit highs they hadn't reached since 2008. They're going to continue to go up. So if you are one of those Americans who lives in a home that's heated by natural gas, and that's half of all Americans, you're going to see your prices rise by 150% over the beginning of this year. And that's going to continue to go up, because we're now having to export, a greater and greater share of our natural gas to Europe, which is seeing price hikes that are far beyond what even we're experiencing now that Russia has cut off natural gas, from the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. So Germans aren't getting gas. Nobody's getting the cheap energy they used to get. We're going to have to subsidize it, which means that the ordinary American energy consumer is suddenly going to have to pay more. It's going to be lots and lots of things like that. Like, people don't realize that stability is just a very delicate thing. You can't just start messing with sort of the fundamental structure of things. On the one hand, you can blame Putin for this because he's the one who started the ball down this road. But we could have isolated the problem and decided not to. And so I think we're going to end up paying quite a heavy price for all this.
Yeah, I agree. And I think a lot of this was we just came out of Afghanistan, and this administration didn't want to show weakness, and it has kind of got out of their control. I think with every escalation, they think, okay, this is the last one, and the war, Ukraine will win, their 31-year-old independence.
Just quickly on that, when the new incarnation of the Democratic Party started in the mid '80s, this is the Clinton Democrats. When they eliminated the old version of the Democrats, there was a group called the Democratic Leadership Council that sort of reinvented what the Democratic Party was. One of their foundational principles was never lose the weakness argument to Republicans again. Wow. Right? So it's imperative for them politically not to be seen as the party that ends wars. And I think you're right. I think, like, getting out of Afghanistan, they looked around to see, well, what can we start? I don't think that's unreasonable to consider.
And that's how we ended up with, like, America bombing a European city, in Yugoslavia, and
right, exactly.
And then, of course, the destruction of Libya, from which there has been like no revival. It's just getting worse and worse since. And these were democratic decisions. Yeah. And all the drone wars, that Obama, all the drone strikes that Obama presided over. Well, it sounds like we're going into a time of reckoning.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very nervous time in American history. It's funny. I lived for 10 years in Russia and the former Soviet Union, and I remember always thinking how relieved I was to come from the United States. I loved Russia. Don't get me wrong. There were so many things about living in that country that I thought were amazing, but just from a basic functionality level, we take for granted things like not having to pay bribes to a traffic cop. I mean, there are a million things about the American experience that are quite nice when you think about it. But we're starting to see some fraying at the edges of the American experience that are really, really scary. I mean, look at Jackson, Mississippi having no drinking water this week. I mean, that would never have happened in the pretty recent past. So people are beginning to have doubts about what this country is all about. We're seeing an escalating number of people who are raising their kids to speak another language because they're anticipating having to leave someday. This is all new. Like, Americans aren't used to this. We're used to being number one, and we're used to being proud of it. And this is an unpleasant feeling for all of us.
Yeah, I agree. This, like, buying, visas and spending like $250,000 and becoming citizens of other countries. It's also, confusing and destabilizing. And, as a new American, I think it's also heartbreaking.
It is. Yeah. Even if you were embarrassed by other aspects of American history, it was always nice to be able to walk into a room of other nationalities and just be like, yeah, we're the big dog in the world, and we're not really anymore. And I saw this with Russians, by the way, after 1991. They even people who hated the Soviet system got used to being part of a massive superpower, and losing that as an element of their character was really catastrophic for a lot of people. Like, I think it took a long time for a lot of Russians to recover from that, and that may start happening with us now.
How interesting! Yeah, and today was Gorbachev's funeral.
Yes, that's right.
Putin lay a wreath. Yeah. That's actually very interesting how it can be like a psychic trauma, for tens of millions of individuals to kind of lose that identity of being the chosen one.
Yeah, I mean, not to interrupt, but I remember I had a friend in college, a Russian friend, who couldn't stand the Soviet system, ended up emigrating to America. He lives in San Francisco now, but I remember him looking at the Soviet map after the revolution and saying, man, what a big, beautiful country we used to be. And, it hurt him, right? It was a wound for somebody like him. I think that was very common for people to be really, really rattled by that. And Americans are we're not used to losing to other countries in basketball. We're not used to all kinds of humiliations that we suffer pretty regularly now. So,
well, you remember, we were supposed to be post-historical and everything had been taken care of, right? We had won and this was like a better world. And then, oopsie, 9/11 and everything else, that came from it, which reminds you that, the ghosts of history are very much with us. And I think without real radical change, we can't be that beacon in the world. We're not just getting in the mud with everybody by participating in all this, in all these conflicts and proxy wars that we don't understand as Americans, what they're about.
Absolutely.
Well, okay. So what are you working on now? Where is your focus these days?
Well, I'm working on a book about, it's really sort of like a version of Griftopia that is focused on the pandemic era. So it's ripoffs in the pandemic era. And that's heavily focused on what happened to that $4.6 trillion. So, doing that, and otherwise just writing a lot on Substack. So
yes. Of course, I follow you on Substack, and I am so impressed that you're there diligently, and you can keep that up. It's extraordinary. I'm like, the guy's like a newspaper.
Right. Yeah. No, it's tough. I mean, the Substack's been great for a lot of people, but the format really requires you to hustle quite a lot. So, but it's been fun. It's been a blast.
You get it down though. You can do it, which is admirable. I mean, I admire you for so much, and mostly for your integrity, for having maintained your integrity through like decades. So thank you for being who you are and your voice.
No, of course. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming on the show. It was a pleasure. And we made some predictions for the next year or two. So
yeah, let's check back in later and
a couple of years.
See if those turn out.
Yeah.
If I could make love incessantly, I would be God.